Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to this talk. My name is Vincent Chiao. I'm an associate professor here at the University of Toronto, Faculty of Law. I work primarily on criminal law and punishment. And excited to talk today about rights, solidarity, and the power to punish in states of emergency. I'll turn it over to you, Corey.
Hi, everyone. Good to be with you. I'm Corey Brettschneider. I'm professor of political science at Brown University. My latest book is called The Oath in the Office. It's a guide to the Constitution for future presidents, and it's partly about what presidents need to know about the Eighth Amendment limits on cruel and unusual punishment. And I've also worked on the political philosophy of punishment, and most recently, I think largely thanks to Vincent, participated in a symposium at Toronto Law School, and I've written a piece called The Democratic Theory of Punishment, which I might mention today as well.
Corey, you need to write a book about how current presidents can obey the Constitution.
I think that's a lost cause. That's one of my...
Fair enough. Fair enough. So I just wanted to maybe take a few minutes to set up our conversation today. I guess the theme of the conversation is sort of the liberal rights in the time of the pandemic. And so just by way of setting things out, I mean, what we observed when the pandemic first rolled into our shores in March was a wide range of sort of really basic fundamental liberal rights, freedom of movement, freedom of association, privacy, religious exercise, being radically curtailed quite quickly by sweeping executive announcements. And so one of the things that I found very striking about this was that rights discourse, which had previously been quite, liberals were quite firm on insisting on rights, individual rights as a limit to government. Rights discourse seemed to collapse almost immediately in the face of the pandemic, government-ordered shutdowns, limitations on gatherings, all these sorts of things. And a lot of the traditional sorts of ways of thinking that philosophers have thought about rights as trumps, rights as side constraints, so preventing the government from acting, even in ways that are meant to facilitate the common good. Rights are meant to limit the government's ability to sacrifice an individual's interests to achieve those aims. Those all seem to kind of fall by the wayside. In a more legalistic kind of framework, here in Canada, for instance, we acknowledge that constitutionally protected rights can be defeated, but they have to go through a fairly rigorous testing process for them to be defeated. The government has to show that there's a rational connection, meaning that we have to know that, or have really good reason to think that the policy is going to work, it's going to do the thing that it is meant to do, that it's proportionate, that the costs to rights are worth the benefits, that it's necessary, there's no other alternative. And these kinds of things require some evidence, require a fair degree of certainty, which, certainly in the early days of the pandemic, and arguably even now, we really lack. We weren't sure what the best approaches were, what actually worked in slowing the pandemic. We weren't sure what the benefits were. We didn't know what the costs were, the long-term costs. And certainly the policy space was completely wide open. It was very hard to say what's necessary under those circumstances. So I guess that I just wanted to maybe sort of put that out there. And Corey, I want to maybe see, is that your perception as well? And what's your take on this?
I think crises are a sort of important moment in thinking about the fundamentals, and they could go one of two ways. The first, I think it's exactly right, that in emergency situations, there's a temptation, especially absent strong leadership, to sort of think, okay, we're not in the space anymore of basic rights. This isn't a normal moment. We're suspending the Constitution. And I've heard a lot of that talk. And of course, I think for consequentialists, that's just revealing the way things have always worked and do work. And yes, of course, in an emergency, you put aside the rights. But, I think that would be a mistake. We're facing all sorts of emergencies, not just the COVID one, but of course, there's an environmental emergency. And to say that because we're facing the true prospect of environmental destruction, there are no more rights, that would be there are consequentialists who think that, but I think that would be way too strong a reaction. So I guess I'm looking too, I think that what you're saying is in a way the default maybe of many leaders, but of other moments too that might open the possibility to see the opposite reaction, the kind of policies that might open our imagination to see that rather than decreasing the amount of rights that we enjoy, we might increase them. So the way I've been thinking about it, the more optimistic side, I think there's the worrying side, which you've exactly identified and sort of motivates us to push back. But on the other side, you know, people in the specific context that we're talking about today, at least in New York and around the country, there's a recognition that given the circumstances that we're in, we have to release people from prison, you know, and we've had, you know, significant numbers of releases around the country in New York. And to me, although that has the structure maybe of we're in an emergency, so we have to do something different, it also opens the possibility to begin to think about punishment more generally and alternatives to incarceration, the rights of individuals within the prison. And thankfully, that is part of, I think, what's going on. It could be framed either as an emergency or as a, we need to protect people in prison from death, and they retain rights to life. So I guess I think of this moment as offering both possibilities, the sort of, I'm not a consequentialist, I'm a big defender of the idea that punishment can't just be thought of in terms of deterrence and in terms of effect, but in terms of the fundamental status and respect for rights. And so I think that we've got to find ways to reframe the decisions that are being made, the intuitively necessary decisions, and think about whether they might, even though they could be, move us towards a world of consequentialism reframed as a sort of rights discourse. I don't know, am I being too optimistic?
Well, I don't know. I mean, I guess what I think I might just have a less sophisticated view. I was just really struck by the way in which public discourse, public norms shifted so quickly, right? So in February, which now feels like a lifetime ago, but in February, for someone to say you're not allowed to sit on a park bench, right? You're not allowed to meet your friends in the park or on the sidewalk, and I'm going to call the police on you if you do, which people in Toronto did do. They did call cops on their neighbors for sitting. That would have been seen as a gross violation of someone's rights. And that just changed right away. So in my neighborhood, for instance, around Toronto, people hang up signs in their windows saying, we're all in this together, which is a very a welcome message. It's a message of solidarity as opposed to the kind of what I associate with rights or individualism, you know, get off my lawn, this is my domain for decision making. It's sort of the opposite of solidarity. And so I saw that shift happen very quickly. And I think that is very striking. So the narrative that you were trying to distance yourselves from, like the consequentialist story, like, well, this maybe just shows that rights were really just kind of a smokescreen or something like that is not a very deep commitment to rights, does seem to fit that narrative a bit. But I'm sort of interested at the level of popular perception of rights. Why did we not see people going to court about this? Why did we not see? So from a lawyer's point of view, you think the courts are the ones you're gonna go to and complain about your rights violations, but nobody seemed to be interested in doing that.
I mean, one thing that we've got going on is a transnational conversation. Of course, you're in Canada and I'm here in the United States. And we were seeing some lawsuits. And I guess, you know, I'm going to sort of invite the difficulty because I'm going to talk about the good and bad lawsuits. I mean, to me, the worrying version of rights were religious institutions early in the pandemic when there really was a danger of spread. Saying that they had to have services inside and that otherwise there was a violation of their religious freedom. And, you know, some states have Religious Freedom Restoration Act with versions of the Religious Freedom Restoration Act, which have upped the level of concern about policies that adversely affect religion. So it's not totally out of the question that some of those cases were going to win, or there were other I believe there was a case that the court didn't take, but the argument was about the federal right of free exercise of religion, and the argument was that there's a kind of animus in these forms of legislation. Now, the sensible thing for the court to do in those situations, I think, is to do the kind of balancing, our version of, we don't call it balancing, but we have a more categorical approach, but we certainly have the idea that a more fundamental, that there is a right on the one hand, and then there are policy interests that can override the right at any level. And certainly whatever level I think we're talking about, whether it's the question of whether it's rational, which is our lowest level of need in thinking about a justifiable policy, or even if we were to return to our earlier jurisprudence or the jurisprudence of the Religious Freedom Restoration Act, where you need a really good reason, a compelling reason that's narrowly tailored in order to overcome the right. The pandemic, to me, inside especially, answered that. And the danger of the spread inside that we were seeing from church services, from choirs in particular because of singing, and the possibility of holding these services online, I think opened that possibility. Now, conservatives who are defending the idea that their rights were violated push back against the more recent protests, and they say, hey, there's a kind of selectivity that's going on here. And if government's distinguishing between good and bad speech, or good and bad beliefs, now that's a real problem. So that is a challenge, I think, that we have to answer. I mean, to me, one real answer to this, I haven't heard this as much, although I take the challenge seriously, is the protests about George Floyd were outside. They had masks. There was an attempt, at least, at social distancing, and you know, that kind of thing can make the difference. So a church, you know, to draw the parallel, that wanted to meet outside and to have masks and to do social distancing, that's fine. Or, you know, and I think at the same time, a protest that wanted to happen inside, you know, in the midst of closings might also be legitimately held accountable. So, you know, we have to, I guess, not throw everything out the window, precisely because at least what I'm trying to do here in comparing the two or distinguishing, there still are rights to be treated as equals in a pandemic. And really throwing it out the window might just say, well, one speech is good, one is bad. And that's the kind of reasoning we definitely don't want to do.
Yeah. I mean, but I guess what's striking though is that, so for instance, think about one thing that I thought about is, so in the criminal justice side, progressives, for instance, have for a long time complained about broken windows policing and stop and frisk policies. And one way of sort of thinking about those complaints is that these are forms of aggressive policing that interfere with the liberty, the rights of especially minority men to move about in public freely. Right, that they can't move about because they constantly get harassed. So you might think that's a very fundamental, hard-won right of movement, and so that right was curtailed when the pandemic struck. And so on the conservative side, you see the sort of religious liberty rights being argued, and it was striking that you didn't see something similar on the progressive side, saying, "Hey, what about my hard-won right to move about?" Which was striking. I mean, one of the things. So that's one issue that I found striking. The other one I want to put on the table here is how this affects how we think about the case for limiting rights. So as you know, as you say, in the United States and Canada, we have slightly different ways of thinking about this, but you know, they're ultimately, I think, fairly similar. So very few people think that rights are just absolute. Right? But what's very striking to me is, like, now we have a sense, oh, okay, so in large scale indoor gatherings where people are singing or talking for a long period of time, you know, masks seem to work. But early on, in March, I think it's hard to overstate the uncertainty. Right? We weren't sure how bad this was going to be, and we weren't sure what was actually going to work. And so how do you make the case that rights have to be potentially quite seriously infringed given such extraordinary uncertainty? I mean, if you're a consequentialist, I think it's a more straightforward way of doing expected costs. But if you're not a consequentialist, it seems a little bit trickier.
Yeah, I mean, I think it might be that second part of the test that you were talking about that we have to pay a special attention to. On the one hand, you know, in both cases, there's a worry about the spread of COVID. And so there's a sort of compelling interest, you might say, even in stopping the spread and in maybe limiting protest or the exercise of religion, mass gatherings generally. And then the question to me is, well, what's the best way to go about, what's the most direct way and the narrowest way to go about that without limiting the right? And, you know, my worry is that people will say, oh, just get rid of all protests. And that can't be. And so, you know, that's why I was trying to distinguish, I think, between the inside and outside. And the Floyd protests are so necessary. I do support them, but I don't want to defend them because they're good. You know, I've got to come up with some principle for why the right has been them. And so that's my way of thinking. Am I gerrymandering it? I'd be open to discussion for people who think that I am, but I think that's a fair and sensible distinction. I mean, we did say, I don't want to lose track of the President of the United States' approach, which I would call, it's not really consequentialist because it wasn't in defense of the nation as a whole or the greatest number, the greatest pleasure for the greatest number or anything like that. It was
defense of the greatest pleasure for one person.
For one person, exactly, sort of Hobbesian, you know, he is the sovereign. But the recklessness with which the military was called out in the front connects, I guess, to speech and religion in front of this church to clear it for a photo op was really frightening. And you see why in the United States, although we have fundamental rights to free speech, rights to petition the government, and rights to assembly, we also have these very dangerous statutes that can be read, and I'll say something a little more about it, to just override those rights. And he was reading this Insurrection Act say that he could use the military really at will to restore order. And, you know, I've been trying to say, hey, wait a second, there are rights here. And there are these earlier memos from the Bush Justice Department that read the statute narrowly, precisely to avoid the revocation of rights. But so, I mean, it just adds another policy layer to what we were talking about. There's a worry generally about suspending rights in times of emergency. And then when you have these statutes combined with I would not call him a successful dictator, but he has the aspirations, as he's told us many times, of dictatorship, armed with this statute, that really is a keg, a dynamite waiting to go off. And so it's even more important to sort of stress those limits. Now, when you look at the statute, just to get a little wonky about this, you know, it's really designed for the Eisenhower-Kennedy instance where a president is coming in to protect rights, not limit them. And yet, that's not what this president was doing. It would have been one thing, by the way, if he was saying, look, the police are attacking African-Americans in this society at dangerous numbers. I'm going to come in to protect their civil rights. That's not what he's doing. He's coming in to limit the protests. So I think that's another dimension here of where we have to think about rights discourse. The connection to punishment, of course, is that these protests are all about a deeply racist form of policing and the protection of police who are murdering people based on, you know, this way disproportionate based on race.
I mean, I see a very similar kind of dialectic playing out in the theory of punishment, in that in normal times, you often have activists and theorists and lawyers saying, well, criminal law should be the last resort. This is what's called the Ultima ratio principle. It should be the last resort, when only if you've tried everything else, only if you really can't protect society in any other way should you resort to this really super harsh kind of a way of dealing with social problems. But whenever there is, say, some horrible child sex crime or something like that in the news, all of a sudden you see criminal law is not the last resort, it's the first resort. And people are angry, they want their pound of flesh, you know, you have terrible policies being enacted without a lot of thought and, you know, a lot of hysteria and fear. I shouldn't say hysteria, I should say, you know, just understandable fear and anxiety and things like this, but it can translate fairly quickly into, I would say, suboptimal policy. So I see a very similar kind of dynamic in the criminal law context. And more generally, I mean, one of the things that you raised, I want to sort of circle back around to, is that, of course, we have seen national crises before, and the track record of sort of executive, untrammeled executive power in times of crises, when the sense is that rights kind of go away, is not great. When we think about Korematsu in the World War II kind of era, Those are Japanese internment cases, or we think about the post 9/11 type of cases. I think those are kind of low points really for us. And so this does feel a little, the pandemic does feel a little bit different than say 9/11, but it at the same time, I do want to say, well, you know, people say who lived through the bombing of Pearl Harbor might have had some fears and anxieties in kind of the way that when, you know, mid-March, this pandemic came onto our radar screen, people had a lot of, and they react in certain ways. And are we going to, in say 50 years time, look back at this in the same way that we look back now at Korematsu and say, boy, that was regrettable.
Yeah, I mean, to me, the use of the military, you know, if it's true that the criminal law is a last resort, that we should worry about the state at its most coercive, even another level up is the military, because they are not trained to respect rights. And when you have these kind of fake military justifications, and Korematsu, for those who are following and who don't know, it is the case in which FDR issues an executive order and aided by Earl Warren rounds up Japanese Americans explicitly based on their national origin. And the Supreme Court knows that. They know it's a presumptive equal protection violation, and yet they say, oh, this is a national emergency, war is on. And my worry is that, you know, he did back down in the military case, partly, I think, because of internal pressure, because of the military publishing former and current military speaking out against the use of the military, but certainly Trump's temptation was to do that. And then we are in a world that looks dangerously like Korematsu. And as much as I would hope that the court would say, hey, you know, you can't do that, we still have basic rights even in a pandemic, we have this frightening precedent of the Supreme Court putting security really over all rights. Now, what's particularly gross about the Korematsu case is that, you know, the evidence now, and my understanding is that they had it at the time, is that they knew there was no actual security rationale, that maybe that was the goal, but there was no connection between the roundup and safety. And so it was just a ruse. And you know, that was true here too. The idea that you were going to need the military to come in to quell violent protests, when really what he was trying to do clearly was to quell peaceful protest. You know, that has a frightening parallel. Now, what would the Supreme Court have done? You know, you and I would be saying Korematsu, the court technically reversed, you know, apologized basically for Korematsu in the travel ban case at the same time that they upheld what was essentially a similar policy. And what would they do in this case? I don't know. I mean, I can't say with confidence that there are 5 votes to say this is unconstitutional use of the military or a violation of the statute. They could very well say, oh, you know, Eisenhower did it and it's a national emergency and we have to defer to the president. Yeah. So that's why, I mean, we're in really heated agreement about why the pandemic is so dangerous, that it allows for these instances. And it's exactly the opposite of what the protests are about, is limiting the power of the state to abuse people.
I guess I want to push back on you a little bit on this, Corey. So in that, so I think I agree with you on sort of the protest case on the Black Lives Matters types of issues, right? I'm thinking now about, say, earlier stage of the response when we were just shutting down businesses, telling people you can't go outside, you can't meet your friends on the sidewalk.
And even that,
even though those are rights violations still, and I think there's a case to be made that says, look, you know, governments, when faced with huge but uncertain risks, should have the freedom to act even in ways that violate rights. So even if, you know, I can imagine 50 years time, say scientists go back and review the data and it turns out that, say, prohibiting people from gathering in parks was kind of pointless, suppose. And I can say, look, there was this, that turned out to have been wrong. Does that show the rights were wrongly limited, that someone sues about this and they have a legitimate cause of action here? And it seems like, well, the government should have some leeway to say, look, you know, yes, it was uncertain. Yes, we can't demonstrate necessity, but we had to. There was a serious threat, and we had to exercise, take a lot of options, act under great uncertainty, and so that might warrant some modification of rights. But then I think then the worry is that genie, once it's out of the bottle, could basically argue for greater deference to executive power in lots of contexts. You don't, so that's my concern, I think.
I see. Yeah, that is a little different. I guess I'd respond by saying, you know, and now maybe I'm going to sort of be more the American constitutional lawyer and you'll be the Canadian. We'll see how it plays out. But I mean, to me, all liberties are not the same. You've really got to look at the specifics. So are you, limiting protests like by a few weeks, and saying just hold off? Are you limiting church services, by a few weeks while we get the data in when we think, or are you targeting speech? I don't want George Floyd protests, or I don't want Protestants to be able to hold services. Those seem to me different in kind, that the temporary suspension of shopping, for instance, to take an easier case, I think is just not the same as the suspension of a protest. And even the way that we might suspend church services and protests once we're in the core rights, I think we can do so in a way that's less or more violative. So another way to put it is, I'm not convinced that shutting down stores, for instance, and I tend not to be a huge defender of property rights as fundamental rights, that the more we're in the domain of commerce and property, the more willing I'm to say, okay, that's one thing. And I get more worried about what you're saying, definitely, the more we're talking about. So, I mean, what do you think? Do you want to push back against that?
I think that makes sense. I mean, I think from someone with consequentialist sort of intuitions, this is all very sensible. I mean, sort of says, the expected harms are lower, so the leeway for actions also a little bit different. One thing I did want to sort of circle back to was, you had painted a sort of optimistic picture of rights culture, or I should say rights, and I want to say rights culture, even in the face of a great national or indeed global emergency. And one way I think this might manifest, so to tell a more optimistic story about the survival or indeed the flourishing of rights, is that you might say, so in North America, United States, Canada, neither country has adopted widespread mandatory contact tracing, digital surveillance, mandatory isolation. We haven't had the really truly hard lockdowns like you've seen in parts of Europe, other parts of the world, or the kind of surveillance state that you have in Asian countries that were that did surveil a lot more. And so you might say that kind of reluctance, slowness of government action, which obviously has been criticized quite a bit, and perhaps rightly, but that slowness, that unwillingness to give up on privacy, things like this, might reflect a kind of rights culture, even if I think it does come at a cost, right? Some people might say, well, if only government had been more proactive, if only they'd allow more surveillance, we could lower the death rate. And that might be true, but it seems like part of rights is, they do come at cost, like they are not free. And part of accepting the right is accepting those costs. Just like, for instance, the right to have, of an accused criminal to have his guilt proven beyond a reasonable doubt means that there are a lot of people who are definitely guilty, but we can't prove it and they go free. And that's just a cost we accept for what we think of as a very important right. So
yeah, that's interesting. I mean, when I guess it's all about the method, to come back to that theme. When you talk about, so say, would it have made sense to create a security net that, measured everybody's temperature, all their biorhythms, everything that you could about a person in order to stop the spread of COVID? And, the initial thought of, and let's just make the hypo even harder, which is, yeah, it would work. It would have slowed the epidemic by X number of weeks. It would have saved the lives of so many people. And I think you and I share the intuition, which is no, partly because if it really was temporary, I might go for it, that this was something that could be dismantled, but we know that that's not how surveillance works. Once you create the materials, they're there. I mean, so during the Bush administration, when Snowden was making his disclosures, whatever you think of him,
right.
A lot of people were saying, what's the big deal? You could trust the president, whether it's Bush or later Obama. I don't think we feel that way now. I don't want Donald Trump in charge of a security apparatus that can measure my temperature. And, Snowden had a pretty good point, regardless of what you think of, him more generally.
Yeah, I wonder to the degree to which that's an American, sort of an American-specific intuition, when Americans are famously, or believed anyway, to have lesser degrees of trust in their government than, say, other advanced democratic countries. So I wonder if you were in a country that had a greater trust in institutions, whether there'd be more willingness to say, well, we trust the government on these kinds of things.
I don't know. I mean, I think we've got multiple strains. You know, one strain is the strain that says, what you just said, we're Americans, we have rights, you can't oppress us, don't tread on me. I'm in New Hampshire right now, live free or die is on every single license plate. It's a little bit extreme, I think.
Right.
Right,
okay.
It might be live free and die if you're not careful.
Yes, right, that's right. That should be the motto, live free and die. That's right.
So, you know, but there is another equally dangerous strain in the other extreme, maybe more, which is that we do. I think we trust that the president, a significant number of Americans trust that the president has their interests at heart and will act well in an emergency. At least I think that was very common, especially before Trump. I think now Trump and Nixon make you rethink that. And but the way the statutes are set up is we have an Emergencies Act that gives the president a power to declare an emergency and can't be stopped unless there are 2/3 of Congress that are willing to do it. We have, you know, the Insurrection Act. I don't know if I called it the Insurgency Act before. It's called the Insurrection Act. That basically hands over broad discretion to the president to use the military, despite other statutes and rights that limit it. And so this sort of handover, it's this kind of schizophrenia. We have the rights culture on the other hand, and then the massive power of the presidency, which to me, you know, the lesson of this is, yes, the extreme rights view is wrong, but also certainly we have to start, as we come out of not just the pandemic, but hopefully the Trump presidency, to think about how to reform that office and not have that extreme power, because it goes with a very dangerous consequentialist vision at best, and at worst, an even more dangerous Hobbesian, I am the sovereign kind of vision.
I think it's notable that in many countries we've seen a sort of rally around the leader kind of effect. Even relatively unpopular leaders people rally around them in times of emergency, but that seems not to be the case now in the United States. Support for Trump seems to have really eroded.
Yeah, but I think it's because he's so incompetent and because he's so foolish and saying these things that we know to be false repeatedly. But imagine somebody slightly smarter than Trump and you have a very different effect and very dangerous. And after 9/11, you know, you saw that especially with Bush. And you actually saw, I'm writing a piece about this now, 2 approaches about the Insurrection Act specifically. One, immediately after the 9/11, John, you wrote a memo saying you could use the Insurrection Act to suppress rights, no problem. You know, safety is the most important thing. And then at the end of the Bush presidency, they say, hey, wait, that doesn't look right. And, you know, we saw that playing out too right now between the 2 approaches within the administration. Yeah,
no, it is remarkable when you say, when you characterize sort of the neoconservatives, the U memo as their position of safety is the most important thing. Of course, that's what the public health people are saying now. Safety is the most important thing. That's why we have to limit rights. So there does seem to be an uncomfortable parallel.
Yes, and you know, I wouldn't say it's Fauci and just the public health people, but it's what Trump was threatening to do with that idea that these protests were so dangerous to public order, and then in the background, of course, so dangerous to public health that we can use the military. And you know, you have these 2 sides. You have the rights idea that you and I are talking about, and you have this strong grant of executive power. And it was a very dangerous moment. He didn't wind up doing it. He was pushed back. But the thing that I just will say, you know, for people watching this, the thing that is just wrong and that I really want to denounce are people who say that because he didn't use the military, he's not a dangerous president or he's not an aspirational dictator. Being stymied in your plans doesn't mean that you didn't have it. Doesn't mean that next time somebody's not going to do it. You're laughing, but I mean, I'm seeing people say that. And the people I know well, if they're watching this, you know, you're not making a good argument.
Well, unfortunately, we don't have to imagine this. I mean, we've seen, I mean, with in Hungary, for instance, or the situation in Hong Kong. I mean, emergency powers, emergency situations are a ripe time for autocrats, unfortunately. So I think that's pretty much what I wanted to cover. Did you have anything else you wanted to put on the table, Corey?
It's always a pleasure to speak with you, Vincent. And, you know, I guess I will just sort of say there's a version of thinking about emergency that says that questions, philosophical and questions in political philosophy and legal philosophy that we're asking, well, that's not important. We're in the emergency. So we should just, you know, act in a sort of expedient way. And that's a dangerous thought. It's great that that we got to sit down and have this
Yeah.
conversation. And I
Yeah.
think it's an important one to have.
Well, I know of no more careful and thoughtful thinker about constitutional rights. So I'm very glad that you had time to share your views. It's a very confusing situation that we're going through. So yeah, I really appreciate it.
Thank you. I appreciate you inviting me, and we have a mutual admiration society. Thanks again.
All right. Talk to you soon, Corey.
Yeah.